Apuleius on the Doctrines of Plato by Apuleius, translated by George Burgess. Book 1, On Natural Philosophy. 1. The conformation of his body gave to Plato his name, for he was previously called Aristocles. His father was said to have been Ariston, while his mother was Perictione, the daughter of Glaucus, and on both sides the nobility of his birth was sufficiently remarkable. For his father Ariston derived through Codrus his origin from Neptune, while the blood on his mother's side flowed from Solon, the very wise, who was the founder of the laws of Athens. There are, however, those who assert that Plato sprang from a more exalted origin at the time when a certain vision in the form of Apollo had a connection with Perictione. He was born in the month called Thargalion at Athens, on the day in which Latona is reported to have brought forth Apollo and Diana at Delos, and on the day before that, in which we have heard that Socrates was born. Mention is likewise made of the pretty dream that Socrates had, for he thought he saw a cygnet flying from an altar, which was in the Academia, sacred to Cupid, and settling on his lap, and that afterwards, a full-fledged swan, it directed its flight to heaven, entrancing the ears of men and gods with the music of its song. And after Socrates had mentioned the dream to some persons, when they had come together, Ariston very opportunely attended upon Socrates, with the view of offering Plato to him as the youth's instructor, on whom, when Socrates had cast his eyes, and saw from his external appearance his internal disposition, he said, "This, friends, is the swan from the altar of Cupid in the Academy." 2. Such, and sprung from such, did Plato not only excel heroes in virtue, but he equaled likewise the gods in power. For Speusippus, who was furnished with family documents, praises the acuteness of the boy's talent in perception, and his disposition as regards his wonderful modesty. And he makes mention of the first fruits of his youth as being imbued with the proofs of labor and his love of study, and testifies that in the man there met together the growth of these, and of other virtues. From the same parents were his brothers Glaucon and Adimantus. For his instructors he had in the rudiments of education Dionysius, and in the Palestra Ariston, a native of Argos, and such a progress did practice bring with it, that he contended for the wrestler's prize at the Pythian and Isthmian games. Nor did he disdain the painter's art. For tragic and dithyrambic compositions likewise he fitted himself, and, carried away by a confidence in his poetical powers, he was already desirous of professing himself a competitor, had not Socrates driven from his mind the lowness of the desire, and taken care to implant in his soul the glory that arises from true praise. And even previously he had been imbued with the doctrines of the sect of Heraclitus. But when he had given himself up to Socrates, he was superior to the rest of the disciples of Socrates, not only in genius and learning, but by labor likewise and elegance he shed a lustre on the wisdom imparted to him by Socrates, by the labor through which he endeavored to make that wisdom his own, and by the elegance through which he contributed to it a considerable dignity from the beauty and majesty of his language. 3. But after Socrates had left the world, he sought out from whence he might make a further progress, and he betook himself to the discipline of Pythagoras. And, though he saw it possessed a method of diligence and splendor combined, he was still more desirous of imitating its continence and chastity. And as he perceived that the talents of the Pythagoreans were aided by other kinds of learning, he went to Cyrene to learn geometry under Theodorus, and travelled even to Egypt to obtain a knowledge of astrology, and that he might learn from thence the rites of the prophets there. And a second time he went to Italy, and became a follower of the Pythagoreans, Eurytus of Tarentum, and Archytas, who was rather advanced in years, and he would have directed his thoughts to the Indians and Magi, had not the wars in Asia at that time prevented him from proceeding thither, on which account, by following out with more than usual study the discoveries of Parmenides and Zeno, he so filled his treatises with things, taken unitedly, which singly had been an object of admiration, that he was the first to unite philosophy, previously tripartite, and to show that its parts, each necessary in its turn, were not only not at variance with each other, but that they afforded a mutual aid. For although the members of philosophy had been obtained from different factories, such as natural philosophy from the Heracliteans, mental from the Pythagoreans, and moral from the very fountain of Socrates, yet from them all he formed one body, and as it were of his own begetting. But as the chiefs of these families of philosophy had delivered to their auditors their sentiments in unpolished language and a rudimental form, Plato rendered them perfect, and even to be admired by polishing them up with reasonings, and investing them with the honorable dress of lofty diction. 4. Many of his hearers, belonging to either sex, flourished as philosophers. He left behind him his patrimony, consisting of a small garden adjoining the academy, and 2 slaves and a goblet, with which he made supplications to the gods, and of gold so much as he had worn when a boy in his ear, to mark his noble birth. Some evil-disposed persons carp indeed at his 3 journeys to Sicily, and discuss them with opinions at variance with each other. But he went thither the first time for the sake of information, that he might understand the nature of Etna, and the burning of the hollow mountain; the second, at the request of Dionysius, to assist the people of Syracuse, and to learn the municipal laws of that province. His third arrival took place in the wish to restore Dion, then an exile, to his country, after Plato had obtained a pardon for him from Dionysius. Of his tenets, that might be called by the Greek word dogmata, which he promulgated for the beneficial use of man, and for a rational method of living, and understanding, and speaking, we will commence from hence. For, since he first held that the 3 parts of philosophy have an agreement with each other, we too will speak of each separately, beginning with natural philosophy. 5. Plato considers the principles of all things to be 3: God, matter, and the forms of things, which he calls ideas, ideas, that are incomplete, shapeless, and distinguished by no mark of species and quality. But of God, his sentiments are that he is incorporeal. He alone, says Plato, is a perimetros, without a circumference, the father and adorner of all things, blessed himself, and the cause of blessings to others, the very best, in want of nothing himself, and conferring all things upon all, whom he calls the heavenly, the ineffable, the not to be named, or, as he says himself, areton, akaton, omeston, whose nature it is difficult to discover, and if discovered, it cannot be proclaimed to the many. But of matter he makes mention as unable to create and to be destroyed, and that it is neither fire, nor water, nor any other of the principles and positive elements, but that of all things it is the first recipient of forms, and subjective to the act of making, and being as yet shapeless and devoid of the quality of configuration, God, as the artificer, gives to it a form universal, which is infinite on that account, because it is a magnitude without a limit. For that which is infinite has the limit of magnitude undefined, and hence, when matter is deprived of limit, it can properly be seen as infinite. Nor yet does he concede that it is with a body, nor without a body. On that account, he thinks it is not a body, because no body is free from some kind of form. Nor yet can he say that it is without a body, because nothing which is without a body can exhibit a body, but that it seems to be with a body by the force of reasoning, and it is therefore to be comprehended not by acting alone, nor yet by the opinion alone of thought. For bodies, through the remarkable evidence of themselves, are known by similar judgment, but that those things which do not possess a bodily substance are seen by cogitation, from whence, opinion being adulterated, the ambiguous quality of this matter is to be comprehended. 6. The idei, namely, the simple forms of all things, he says, are eternal, nor yet with a body, but they exist from such as God has taken as the patterns of things which are or will be. And he says it is not possible for anything to be found beyond the individual images in the patterns of each species, and that of all existing things, the forms and configurations are marked out from the impression of those patterns in the manner of wax impressions. Ousiae, which we call essentiae, existences, he says are twofold, through which all things are produced, and even the world itself, one of which is perceived by reflection alone, the other can be subjective to the senses. Now, that which is perceived by the eyes of the mind is found to exist forever, and in the same manner, and equal and similar to itself, and what truly is. But the other is to be estimated by opinion, affected by a sense and a want of reason, and which he says is produced and perishes. And as the former is said to exist truly, so the latter, we may say, does not exist truly. And of the first substance or existence is the first, God, and matter, and the forms of things, and the living principle. Of the second substance are all the things which receive a form, and are generated, and derive their origin from a pattern of the former substance, and which are able to be changed and turned about, gliding away and escaping in the manner of flowing water. Moreover, since that substance of perception which I have mentioned rests upon a power that is consistent, the points that are made the subject of dispute relating to it are full of firm reasoning and belief. But of the latter, which is the shadow, as it were, and the image of the former, the reasonings and the words which are used in disputes relating to it are expressed by a method of teaching which is not consistent. 7. The beginning of all bodies he has stated to be matter, and that it is marked by the impress of forms, and that from hence have been produced the elements, fire and water, earth and air, which ought, if they are elements, to be simple, nor to be united by a mutual connection after the manner of syllables. What takes place in the case of those things, whose substance is made up by the coming together of powers in many ways, which, when they had been in no order and mixed together, were brought by the Deity, who is the builder of the world, into order by means of numbers and measures in a circuit. These, he says, were reduced from very many elements into one, and that fire, and air, and water have their origin and beginning in a triangle which is right-angled, but with unequal angles, but that the earth is formed of direct angles, triangles, and of equal footsteps, and that of the former form 3 kinds exist, the pyramidal, the octangular, and 20-angular, but that the sphere and pyramid have in themselves the figure of fire, and that the octangular sphere is dedicated to air, and the 20-angular to water, but that the triangle with equal feet forms out of itself a square, and the square a cube, which is peculiar to the earth. On which account he gave to fire the movable form of the pyramid, because the quickness of one seemed to be very similar to the rapid movement of the other. But of secondary velocity is the octangular sphere. This he assigned to the air, which in lightness and quickness is the second after fire. The sphere with 20 angles is in the third place. Of this, the rolling form seemed to be rather like that of flowing water. There remains the form of dice, a cube, which, since it is immovable, has not absurdly obtained by lot the steadiness of the earth. Other beginnings, too, he says, might be discovered, which are known to God, or to him who is a friend of the gods. 8. But of the primary elements, fire, and water, and the rest, he asserts the slight bodies of things with life, and without it, consist in the shape of particles, but that the world, taken as a whole, is made up of the whole of water, and the whole of fire, and the whole of air, and the whole of earth, and that not only no portion of these is left without the world, but that its power even is not found beyond it, and that these are fitted to and connected with each other within it, and, consequently, its seat is in fire, earth, water, and air. And as fire is united to air by a certain relationship, so moisture is united by an affinity to earth. Hence he says that there is one world, and in it all things, nor is there a place left in which another world could be, nor are there other elements remaining from which there could be formed the body of another world. Moreover, there is attributed to it a perpetual youth and a never injured health. And further, there is nothing left out of it that can corrupt its natural condition, and if there remained anything out of the world, it would not injure it, since it is on every side so put together and arranged that what is adverse and contrary cannot do an injury to its nature and discipline. On this account, then, it has been sought by the fabricating God, in behalf of the world, which, like a beautiful and perfect sphere, is the most perfect and most beautiful, that it should be in want of nothing, and contain all things by shutting in and restraining them, and be beautiful and wonderful, like to and answering to himself. Now, since there are held to be these 7 movements in space, the forward and backward, the right and the left, and of things that strive to move upwards and downwards, and of those that are twisted into a spiral and circuit, this one way, peculiar to wisdom and prudence, was left for the world, after the 6 former had been laid aside, that it should revolve according to reason. And this world, he says, is now with a beginning, but otherwise it has an origin, and was produced, for there is no beginning or commencement, because it existed always, but that it seems to have been produced because its substance and nature consist of those things which have obtained by lot the quality of being produced. Hence it is tangible and visible, and comes under the senses of the body. But because God has afforded a cause for its being produced, it is, on that account, about to be forever of an immortal endurance. 9. But the soul of all living beings, he says, is incorporeal, nor will it perish when it shall have been released from the body, and that it is older than all things produced, and that it therefore has a command over, and rules those things of which it has obtained by lot the diligent care, and that it is ever moved by itself, and is the mover of other things, which are by their nature unmoved and sluggish. And he proclaims that the heavenly soul, which is the fountain of all souls, and the best and wisest parent of virtues, is subservient to God the Maker, and is at hand for all his inventions, but that the substance of this mind is made up of numbers and measures, by means of increase doubled and multiplied, and of increments obtained from themselves and from without. And hence it happens that the world is moved according to a system of music, instrumental and vocal. He says, too, that the natures of things are twofold, and that one of them is that which can be seen by the eyes, and touched by the hand, which he calls doxastein, the subject of opinion, and the other is that which presents itself to the mind, called dianoetike, the subject of cogitation and intellect. For, let pardon be granted, to a novelty in words, that minister to the obscurity of things, and that the former portion is mutable, and easy for a person beholding it, but that the latter, which is seen by the eye of mind, and is perceived and conceived by reflection that penetrates it, is incorruptible, immutable, enduring, and the same forever. Hence, twofold too, he says, is reasoning and interpretation. For the latter, which is visible, is inferred by a suspicion, accidental, and not so very enduring, but the former, which is intelligible, is proved to be true by ratiocination, perpetual and constant. 10. But time, he says, is an image of eternity, although time is subject to motion, while the nature of eternity is fixed and motionless, and that time goes into it, and can be ended and resolved into its magnitude, if at any time God, the maker of the world, shall so determine, and that by the spaces of the same time the measures of the revolution of the world are comprehended, since the globes of the sun and moon do this, and the rest of the stars, which we do not correctly say, are wandering and wandering. For our opinions and disputations respecting their orbits may be led from the reality by an error of the understanding, whereas the disposer of all things has so appointed their returnings, risings, settings, recessions, delays, and progressions, that there is no place left for even a moderate error, since days with nights fill up the space of a month, and months in their turn roll on the circle of a year. Nor was it possible for the numeration of time to be entered upon before those signs began to burn in the starry light, and the keeping of this reckoning would have perished, if this antique chorus had stood still of old. For, that the measures and returns of time might be known, and the circuit of the world be seen, the light of the sun was lit up, and in turn the darkness of night invented, that desired rest might come to living beings. And a month was made up, when the moon, after completing the course of her circle, returned to the same spot from which she had departed, whereas the space of a year is completed, when the sun shall have reached the 4 changes of the seasons, and be carried back to the same sign. The enumeration of those that return into themselves, and of those that depart from themselves, he discovered by the contemplation of the understanding. And he says that there are nevertheless determinate revolutions of the stars preserved forever in their legitimate courses, which the skill of man can with difficulty comprehend. From whence it happens that the so-called great year is known very easily, the time of which will be filled up when the company of the wandering stars shall arrive at the same end, and recover for itself a new commencement and a journey through the roads of the world. 11. But of the celestial orbs, united to each other by mutual changes, the highest of all is that which is reckoned as the path of the non-wandering stars, by whose embrace the rest are restrained, and that to the non-wandering the first place was assigned, the second to Saturn, the third to Jupiter, that Mars holds the fourth, that the fifth is assigned to Mercury, that the sixth belongs to Venus, and that the seventh is burnt up by the passage of the sun, and that the moon measures the eighth. Hence he says that all things are occupied by elements and principles, that fire is above all, and next is the place of air, that next is that of water, and next that the orb of earth, situated in the middle, stands equal in place and immovable in figure. He says, too, that these fires, fixed to the spheres of the stars, glide on in their courses perpetual and untired, and that they are living gods, but that the nature of the spheres is nourished by, and made out of, fire. Moreover, the races of living beings are divided into 4 species, one of which is of the nature of fire, of such a kind as we see the sun and moon to be, and the rest of the stars in the constellations. Another is of the quality of air, and this, he says, is that of daimons. The third is a coalescence of water and earth, and that the mortal race of bodies is from this, and divided into the terrene and terrestrial, for so he considered the koika should be called, and that terrene belongs to trees and other productions, which drag out an existence while they are fixed to the ground, but terrestrial to things which the earth feeds and sustains. Of gods, he enumerates three kinds, of which the first is that one and alone the highest, who is beyond the world, and incorporeal, whom we have shown above to be the father and architect of this divine world. Another is such as the stars possess, and the rest of the deities, whom we call the heaven inhabiting. The third embraces those whom the old Romans called medioxumi, because they are, with relation to themselves and place and power, inferior to the highest gods, but naturally superior to man. 12. But all things which are carried on naturally, and on that account correctly, are governed by the guardianship of Providence. Nor can the cause of any evil be ascribed to God, on which account Plato conceives that not all things are to be referred to the lot of fate. For he gives this definition, that Providence is a divine determination, the conservator of the prosperity of that for the sake of which it has undertaken such an office, and that fate is a divine law by which the inevitable designs of and the acts commenced by the deity are fulfilled. And hence, if anything is done by Providence, it is done likewise by fate, and that which is finished by fate should seem to have been commenced by Providence. Now, the first Providence is that of the highest power, and the most above all the gods, who has ordained not only the deities that dwell in heaven, whom he has dispersed to be a guard and glory through all the members of the world, but has given birth, for ages upon ages, to the deities naturally mortal, who are superior in wisdom to the rest of beings that live upon earth, and, after laying down laws, he delivered over to the other deities the disposition and guardianship of the other matters which were necessary to be done daily. From whence, so strenuously did the deities of the second providence keep their hold of the providence undertaken by them, that all things which are shown to mortals from heaven preserve the state of the Father's arrangement unchanged. But the daimons, whom we might call genii and lares, Plato decides are the servants of the gods, and the protectors of man, and their interpreters, should they wish for anything from the gods. Nor does he think that all things are to be referred to the force of fate, but that there is something in ourselves, and something too in fortune. He confesses, however, that the unforeseen accidents of fortune are not known to us, for that something unsteady and running against us is wont to come between the affairs which may have been undertaken with design and meditation, so that it does not permit what has been thought upon to come to an end. And when that impediment arrives advantageously, the circumstance is called good fortune, but misfortune when those hindrances are of a noxious kind. 13. Of all earthly things, nothing more excellent has Providence given than man. Well, therefore, does the same Plato proclaim that the soul is the mistress of the body. But since he asserts that the parts of the soul are three, the reasoning power, which is the best portion of the mind, he says has possession of the citadel of the head, but that the feeling of anger, which is distant from the reasoning power, is carried down to the domicile of the heart, and follows it, and in place answers to wisdom, and that lust and desire, the lowest portion of the mind, occupy the lowest seats of the belly, as if they were certain stews and hiding places of jakes, the resorts of iniquity and luxury, and that this portion seems to have been removed at a greater distance from wisdom, lest by an unseasonable vicinity reason might, while consulting for the safety of all, be disturbed in the usefulness of its reflections. He says, too, that the whole of man is in the head and face, for prudence and all the senses are contained in no other part of the body but that, since the rest of the members act as handmaidens, and are subservient to the head, and minister food and other things, while the crown of the head is placed on high, as a lord and ruler, and, by its providence, to be delivered from dangers. Moreover, that the organs with which the senses are furnished for perceiving and judging of quantities and qualities are placed in like manner near the palace of the head, within the view of reason, in order that the truth of understanding by the mind and perceiving by the body may be assisted. 14. But the senses themselves, being fitly formed by nature, have a cognate intelligence as regards those things which are the objects of sense. In the first place, the twin pupils of the eyes are very clear, and, shining with a certain light of vision, they possess the office of knowing light, while hearing, by partaking of the nature of air, has a perception of sounds through messengers in the air, whereas the taste, being a sense more relaxed, is on that account suited to things rather moist and watery, but the touch, as being of the earth and corporeal, perceives things that are rather solid, and which can be handled and struck against. Of those things, likewise, which are changed when corrupted, there is a separate perception, for in the middle region of the face nature has placed the nostrils, by the double doorway of which there passes an odor together with the breath, and that conversions and changes furnish the causes of smelling, and that they are perceived from substances when corrupted or burnt, or in a mucus or moistened state. When those substances are sought out, they are exhaled in vapor and smoke, the judgment and sense of a smell come upon them. For if the substances are sound, and the air pure, they never vitiate the gales of that kind. Now, these very senses are common to us and the rest of animals, but by the divine blessing, the skill of man in that way is better furnished, and more advanced, since his hearing and sight are superior. For he measures with his eyes the heavens, and the orbits of the stars, and the settings and risings of the constellations, and he understands their distances, together with the signs they give, from which has flowed the most beautiful and plentiful fountain of philosophy. And what could happen to man more magnificent than the sense of hearing, by which he learns simultaneously prudence and wisdom, and measures, and makes the numbers and modes of speech and melody, and becomes himself entirely attuned and musical? To this has been added the tongue, and the outwork of the teeth, and the beauty of a little mouth, which has been furnished to other animals indeed for supplying the necessities of living, and bringing to the belly its resources, but to man this has been given as the storehouse of right reasoning and of sweetest discourse, in order that what forethought has conceived in the heart, speech might bring forward to be understood. 15. Moreover, the bearing of the whole body and the form of the limbs are under one condition the best, but under another worse. The inferior are ruled by the superiority of the chiefs, and they perform the ministering suited for living. Finally, the feet, as far as the shoulders, obey the head. But the hedge of the eyebrows protects the eyes, lest anything should rush down from above to disturb vision, which is tender and soft. The lungs, by their place and affinity, look very much to the welfare of the heart, for when it burns with anger, and is palpitating with rather quick movements, the top of the heart itself, wet with blood, is received by the softness and thirst, and cold of the lungs. But the spleen is near, and not vainly so, to the liver, that it may relieve its redundance by sharing in its absorptions, and by cleansing what is filthy render the liver pure and clear, which is very advantageous to its fibers. He says too that the belly is furnished with the folds of the intestines, but that there is an impediment by ligatures, so that what is eaten and drank may not pass through the place of sitting quickly, but by being retained for a little time, they may show their utility to animals by their approach, and that the necessity of desiring food may not be impending at every moment, through those things being exhausted and passing off which had been introduced, and that there may not be a need for us to be occupied night and day for this purpose alone. 16. Moreover, the bones are covered with flesh, and the same are bound to nerves. Yet, nevertheless, the members, which are the intermediate messengers of feeling, are hidden by flesh, in order that the sensations may not be blunted by the thickness of the flesh. Those, too, that are connected by joinings and couplings for a rapidity in moving themselves easily, are not impeded by much flesh. Lastly, look at the top of the head itself, and you will see it covered with a thin skin, and shaggy with hair, a protection against the violence of cold and heat. But those parts are plump, which labor wears down, as for instance the buttocks themselves, where is the region of sitting. What shall I say of the food, which the roads that emanate from the womb, and are joined to the fibers of the liver, disperse after being turned into the form of blood, so that nature may skillfully cause it to flow like a river from that place through all the joints? But from the region of the heart, the meanderings of the veins take their rise, transferring through the coils of the lungs the liveliness which they had received from the heart, and, being again distributed from that place through the whole limbs, they assist the whole man by his breathing. From hence the alternations in breathing are drawn and given back in turn, in order that they may not be impeded by their mutual meetings. The qualities, too, of the veins are various, which, it is well known, flow for the purpose of procreation from the region of the neck through the marrow of the loins, and are received into the place of the male organ, and again, that Venus excites the productive receptacle of seed, so that his power departs from a man. 17. But when he says that the substances of the whole body are various, he means that the first seem to consist of fire and water, and the other elements; the second of similar particles of the intestines, small bones, blood, and the rest of substances; the third of members discordant and various, that is, of head, belly, and unequal joints. From whence the substance which consists of simple elements, if that which by the necessity of living is asked for, in what manner it agrees even with the genus of each, guards the quality and temperature of the body, and increases the strength for those particles which consist of the like, and of those which we have said above are unlike to each other, it nourishes the beauty, and at the same time that equality of dry, moist, hot, and cold gives health, strength, and form, just as an intemperate and immoderate permixture, while particles are individually and universally corrupted, destroys a living being with a rapid dissolution. 18. The same philosopher says that the soul is tripartite, for that one part is rational, another hot with anger, or irritable, the third we may call a longing, and give to the same feeling the name of lustfulness; but that healthiness, and strength, and beauty are then present to a being with soul, when reason rules it wholly, and passion and pleasure, two inferior parts, are obedient to reason, and, agreeing amongst themselves, long for nothing, and make no stir that reason deems to be useless. Now, when the parts of the soul are regulated to an equability of that kind, the body is broken down by no disturbance, otherwise it introduces a sickness, and unhealthiness, and foulness, when the parts are, with respect to each other, not well put together, and unequal, as when desire subdues anger and good counsel, and brings them into subjection with itself, or when anger, more hot than usual, overcomes reason, the mistress and queen, while desire is obsequious and appeased. But the sickness of the mind he says is a folly, and he divides it into two parts. One of these he calls unskilfulness, the other madness, and he says that the disease of unskilfulness takes place from a vainglorious boasting, when a person falsely lays claim to the learning and knowledge of those things, of which he is ignorant; but that madness is wont to arise from very depraved habits and a lustful life, and that this madness, which a vicious quality of body produces, is called so, when those things which are prepared by reason in the top of the head become contracted by inopportune straits; but that a man is then perfect when soul and body are united together, and agree with and respond to each other, so that the firmness of mind be not inferior to the very strong powers of the body. The body, however, is increased then by natural increments, when the portion of good health, being attended to with skilful art, knows not to exceed the measure of necessary living, and when health is not worn down by the greatness of external labors, nor by the weight of food introduced too immoderately, or not digested and distributed through the body as it should be. For then the joints and limbs retain the measure and force of due vigor, when that which is introduced for the preservation of the whole body is distributed to all the parts, as it were in equal proportions for each. But when that takes place in the least degree, then ensues the destruction of the body. Book 2. On Moral Philosophy. 1. The head of moral philosophy is, son Faustinus, that you may know by what means it is possible to arrive at a happy life. But previous to the other matters which are known to appertain to happiness, which is the end of good things, I will show what Plato thinks upon this point. Of good things, then, he thought that some were preeminently so, and in themselves the first, but the rest he conceived were good through a participation. The first good things are God, the highest, and that mind which he calls nous. Secondly, the things which flow from the fountain of the first are the virtues of the mind, namely prudence, justice, modesty, and fortitude. But that amongst all these, prudence is the superior. But as the second in number and power, he laid down continence. To these succeeds justice, while fortitude is the fourth. In good things likewise he made this distinction, that some are of God, and in themselves the first, and are called simple goods. Others are of man, nor are the same good things thought to be so by all, on which account the virtues of the mind are of God and simple, but those of man, which are goods in the opinion of some, are such as agree with the conveniences of the body, and are what we call external, which to the wise and those who live rationally and moderately are really good, but must needs be evils to the unwise and to those who are ignorant of their use. 2. The first good is the true and divine and best, and worthy to be loved and desired, and for the beauty of which the minds that are under the influence of reason have a longing, under the guidance of nature, and are by the same power lit up to an ardent love for it. But as not all are able to obtain it, nor can possess the faculty of acquiring the first good, they are carried on to that which is of man. The second good is not common to many, nor is it in a similar manner a good to all. For the longing after, and the desire to do anything, is excited either by a true good, or by what seems to be a good, from whence, under the guidance of nature, there is a certain affinity between good things and that portion of the soul which agrees with reason. But he considers that to be a good by accident which is united to the body and to things that come from without, and that he, who is imbued by nature to follow what is good, thinks he has been born not only for himself, but for all men likewise, and that each one has been conceived, not in an equal or similar manner, but for the state, and next for those nearest to him, and then for the rest, who are united to him by familiarity or acquaintance. 3. That a man is, he says, too, born, neither absolutely good from his stock, nor bad, but that his disposition inclines to both. That he has indeed some seeds of both, which are united to the origin of his birth, but which by the discipline of education ought to burst out into another part, and that the instructors of boys ought to have no greater care than to thoroughly imbue them with morals and instructions, so that they may wish to become lovers of virtues, and learn to rule, and be ruled by justice as their mistress. On which account the boys ought to be brought to this point, beside all the rest, that they may know that the things which are to be followed and avoided are honorable and dishonorable, that to the former belong pleasure and praise, to the latter disgrace and baseness, and that we ought with confidence to wish for the honorable things which are good. Of dispositions, three kinds are classed by him, of which he calls one the superior and preeminent, another the most foul and the worst. The third, which is tempered moderately from both, he calls a mean. In this mean he desires to be partakers the docile boy and the man who is making a progress to moderation, and who is mild in his manner, and elegant, since he asserted that a mean of the same kind, called a third something, occurs in the case of virtues and vices, through which some acts are to be praised and others blamed. Thus, between knowledge of one kind firm, of another false, there is an obstinacy of mind united to a vanity. Between a chaste and a lustful life he interposed abstinence and intemperance, and has made shame and sluggishness as the means between fortitude and fear. Since of those persons whom he wished to appear moderate, neither the virtues were sincere, nor the vices sheer and untempered, but mixed up on this side and on that. 4. But the wickedness of a person stained with all vices he said was the worst, which he asserted took place when that portion which is the best and rationable, and ought to rule the rest, was the slave of others, and when those leaders into vices, namely anger and lust, are the lords, while reason is sent under the yoke. From things likewise quite different, such as abundance and want, is wickedness made up. Nor by the fault of an inequality alone does he consider that wickedness goes halting, but that it falls upon a dissimilitude, for it could not agree with goodness, since it differs in so many ways from itself, and carries before it not an inequality, but an incongruity. On which account he says that the three portions of the soul are pressed by three vices. Thus against prudence fights indocility, which not only introduces the destruction of science, but is adverse to the discipline of learning. Of this indocility we have received from him two kinds: one, unskillfulness and stupidity, of which it is found that unskillfulness is a foe to wisdom, but stupidity to prudence; another, anger and boldness. Its companionship, indignation, follows, and unmovableness, called in Greek aurgesia nou tis. For so I would say, which not only extinguishes the excitement of anger, but fixes them down by a stupor not to be moved. To the feelings of desire he applies luxuriousness, that is, a longing after pleasures, and insatiable draughts of things desired, for enjoyment and possession. From this luxuriousness there flows avarice and wantonness, of which the former puts a restraint upon liberality, the latter, by living too immoderately, squanders the means of a patrimony. 5. But of a mind, the best, says Plato, virtue is the bearing that presents a noble figure, and which makes the person, on whom it is faithfully impressed, to be in accordance with himself, and tranquil and consistent, not in words alone, but in deeds likewise, agreeing with himself and the rest of mankind. And this is the more likely, should reason, seated on the throne of its kingdom, hold the appetites and passions ever in subjection and under the rein, and they so obey it as to do their ministering tranquilly. He says, however, that virtue is of one form, because that which is good by its own nature has no need of assistance, but that it may be perfect, it ought to be content with solitude. Nor is quality alone united to the natural disposition of virtue, but similitude likewise, for so does it agree with itself on every side, that it is fitted from itself and answers to itself. Hence he speaks of virtues as means, and the same too as extremes, not only because the former are from redundance and want, but because they are placed in the middle ground of virtues. For example, fortitude is surrounded on this side by boldness, on that by timidity. Now, boldness comes from the abundance of confidence, but fear from the fault of a deficient boldness. 6. Of virtues, some are perfect, others imperfect. Now, those are imperfect which, by the kindness of nature alone, come forth in all, or are furnished by discipline alone, or are taught by reason as a mistress. Those, therefore, that are made up of all, we say are perfect. He denies, however, that imperfect virtues accompany themselves. But those which are perfect, he conceives on that account especially to be inseparable and united to each other, because, for the person who has an uncommon natural disposition, if there be added industry, practice, and the discipline which reason, the ruler of affairs, has laid down, there will be left nothing that virtue cannot furnish. He divides all the virtues amongst the parts of the soul, and he calls that virtue which relies upon reason, and is the spectator and judge of all matters, prudence and wisdom, of which he wishes for wisdom to appear as the instruction of things divine and human, but prudence as the knowledge of understanding good and evil things, and those which are between the two. In that part, then, which is considered as given rather to anger, is the seat of fortitude, and the strength of the soul, and the nerves required for fulfilling those things, which are imposed upon us rather hardly by the rule of laws to be done. The third part of the mind belongs to desires and regrets, of which abstinence is necessarily the companion, whom he wishes to be the preserver of an agreement in those things that are naturally right and wrong in man. By this is lustfulness turned to mildness and moderation, and by the method and modesty of this, voluptuary doings, he says, are restrained. 7. Through these three parts of the soul, he places a fourth virtue, namely justice, as dividing itself equally, and the cause of it, he says, is knowledge, in order that each portion may be obedient, both to reason and moderation, in performing its duty. This the demigod at one time calls justice. At another he includes it in the appellation of virtue in general, and addresses it likewise by the name of faithfulness. But when it is useful to the person by whom it is possessed, it is benevolence. But when it looks abroad and is the trustworthy spectator of utility to another, it has the name of justice. There is, too, that justice which obtains the fourth place in the ordinary division of virtues, which is coupled with religiousness, that is, in Greek, asiates, of which the latter, religiousness, is a slave devoted to the honor of the gods, and to the supplications in a divine right, while the former, justice, is the remedy and medicine of human society and concord. Now, for two equal reasons, justice rules over human utility, of which the first is the observance of equality in numbers and divisions, and in those matters which have been bargained for according to a contract. Add to this, that it is the guardian of weights and measures, and of the common distribution of public property. The second reason is that relating to boundaries, and is a sharing proceeding from equity, so that a becoming ownership in lands may be assigned to each person, and the better portion be preserved for the good, but the worse for the bad. Add to this, let everyone who is by nature and industry the best be preferred for honors and offices, but let the worst be in want of the light of dignity. Now, in assigning and preserving honor, that is the just measure on the part of him who is the aider of the good, and the overthrower of the bad, that those things may ever be preeminent in the state, which are about to be of service to all, but that vices, together with their authors, may lie low, and be trodden down. 8. Which result will be the more easily obtained if we are supplied with two examples, one of a person divine, tranquil and happy, another of a person irreligious, inhuman, and deservedly detestable, so that he who is a stranger to, and averse from a correct manner of living, would wish his faculties to be more like to those of the worst man, but the good person his to those of the divine and heavenly man. Hence there are with him two portions of the oratorical art, one of which is the discipline that contemplates what is good, and is tenacious of what is just, and fitted to, and agreeing with, the sect of that philosopher who wishes to appear a statesman; but the other is the science of flattering, the catcher at what is like the truth, and an experience brought together without any reason. For so we express alagon tribein, irrational exercise, which wishes that to be received by persuasion which it is unable to teach. Now this Plato has defined as dunamin to peithein, aneu to didaskein, a power to persuade without teaching, and to which he has given the name of the shadow, that is, the image of a portion of the statesman's art. But statesmanship, which he calls politikein, he wished to be so understood by us that we should consider it in the number of virtues, and that not only the person who is acting and occupied in the very administration of affairs should be viewed by it, but that things universally should be discerned by it, and that not only forethought is profitable to state affairs, but that all the statesman's feelings and design should be to render the situation of the state fortunate and happy. 9. Now, this same statesman's art has a care for the usefulness of the soul by two methods. One relates to law-giving, the other to law courts. The former is similar to the exercise by which is acquired the beauty and strength of the soul, just as by exercise the health and beauty of the body is preserved, but that relating to law courts is on a par with medicine, for it cures the diseases of the soul, as medicine does those of the body. These he calls disciplines, and professes that an attention to them brings a very great advantage, while their imitators are the arts of cookery and perfumery, but that the sophist's art, and the bland profession of the law, and the allurements of flattery are disgraceful to those who profess them, useless to all, of which arts he unites that of the sophist to that of the cook. For as the art of the cook sometimes catches the good opinion of the imprudent by its professing medical science, as if the things which it is doing are suited to the cure of disorders, so the art of the sophist, by imitating the manner of law courts, furnishes to fools a good opinion, as if that art were attending to justice, which it is clear is favoring iniquity; whereas the professors of law imitate the art of the perfumer. For, while this wishes to be the remedy through which beauty and health are preserved in bodies, it not only diminishes the usefulness of the body, but breaks down its strength and powers, and changes the true color of the blood to slothfulness, so that, by imitating the science of law, pretends indeed to be able to increase virtue in souls, whereas it weakens whatever there is in them of natural industry. He thinks, moreover, that those virtues can be taught and studied which appertain to a rational soul, that is to say, wisdom and prudence, and that those which, in the place of a remedy, offer a resistance to the portions of the soul that are corrupt, namely fortitude and continence, are rational. Now the virtues before mentioned are held to be in the place of discipline; the rest, if they are perfect, he calls virtues; but if only half perfect, he conceives they ought not indeed to be called disciplines, nor yet does he consider them to be entirely strangers to discipline. But justice, in that it is scattered amongst three parts of the soul, he imagines to be the art of living and a discipline, and that is at one time teachable, and at another proceeds from use and experience. 10. Of good things, some, he asserts, are to be sought for the sake of themselves, as, for example, happiness, and a pleasure that is good; others, for not their own sake, as medicine; others, for the sake both of themselves and something else, as forethought and the rest of virtues, which we seek after, both for their own sake, as being in themselves excellent and honorable, and for the sake of something else, that is to say, of happiness, which is the fruit of virtue the most to be wished for. On this ground, some bad things are to be avoided for the sake of themselves, others for the sake of other things, but the majority for the sake of themselves and of other things, as, for example, folly and vices of that kind, which are to be avoided, both for the sake of themselves and for the sake of those things, namely misery and unhappiness, which may arise from them. Of those things which are to be sought after, some, we say, are absolutely good, those, to wit, which, when they are present always and to all, bring with them advantages, as, for example, the virtues, of which happiness is the fruit. Others are a good to some persons, and not to all, nor always, as, for instance, strength, health, wealth, and whatever relate to the body and depend on fortune. In like manner, of those things too, which are to be declined, some appear always and to all to be evils, when they are a hurt or an obstacle, as, for instance, vices and misfortunes. Some are a hurt, and that too not always to some, as, for instance, sickness, want, and other things of a similar kind. 11. But that virtue is at liberty, and placed in ourselves, and is to be sought for with willingness, but that sins, although not less at liberty, and placed in ourselves, are not to be entered upon with willingness. For the beholder of virtue, when he shall have understood that it is thoroughly good and excels in kindness, will make for himself a road to it, and will think it ought to be pursued for its own sake. In like manner, how can he, who shall have perceived that vices not only bring disgrace upon reputation, but do a hurt in another manner, and are guilty of a fraud, be able to unite himself of his own accord to their fellowship? But if he proceeds to evil things of that kind, and believes that the use of them is advantageous to himself, through his being deceived by an error, and tempted by some image of good, he is, while ignorant of the truth, thrown headlong into ills. For you would vary from common opinion, when you are indeed not ignorant, what difference there is between poverty and wealth, and when these matters are placed easy to know, namely, that neither poverty brings honor, nor wealth baseness, you should prefer the want of things necessary for living to the abundance of means, and you would seem to be silly, and to pursue a conduct still more absurd than does the person who despises the health of the body by choosing in preference disease. 12. But that is an act of extreme madness, when he, who shall have beheld with the eyes of the soul the beauty of virtue, and shall have discovered by use and reason its utility, shall still, while not ignorant how much of disgrace and disadvantage he shall obtain from a participation in vices, be willing to give himself up to them. He says, too, that the health of the body, and strength, and freedom from pain, and other things of that kind, are extraneous, and that wealth likewise, and the rest of things, which we consider the advantages of fortune, are not to be called simply good. For if any one who possesses them withdraws himself from their use, they will be useless to him, and if any converts their use to wicked purposes, they will be seen to be even hurtful to him. But if any one abuses them, he will be exposed to vices, while he who possesses them is unable to hold them when he is dead. From hence it is inferred that these ought not to be called simply good things, nor ought those which sow diseases or poverty, and other things to be considered evils. For he, whose property is small, and who is moderate in his expenses, will perceive no mischief coming from it, while he, who makes a right use of his poverty, will not only find no disadvantage, but on the contrary will become superior in enduring the rest of evils, with a better method. If, then, it is not contrary either to have poverty, or to rule over it by reason, poverty is not by itself an evil. Pleasure, moreover, he says, is neither absolutely a good, nor simply an evil, nor is that to be fled from, which is honorable, and proceeds not from things to be ashamed of, but from glorious doings. but that which nature herself spurns, and is sought after with disgraceful delight, he considers ought to be avoided. Anxiety and labor, if they are natural, and descend from virtue itself, and are undertaken for the performance of some remarkable act, he considered to be an object of desire, but that they are bad and detestable if they are produced, contrary to nature, for the sake of things the most base. Not only does he know that vices fall on the soul by an act of the will, and come to bodies, but that there is a certain middle state, such as when sadness is absent, nor yet do we perceive that gladness is present. 13. Of the things which are in ourselves, the first good and worthy of all praise is, to the person seeking a good virtue. On that account, it ought to be called honorable, since we say that what is honorable is alone good, and what is base bad, and deservedly so. For what is base cannot be good. Friendship, he says, is a fellowship, and consists in a fellow feeling, and is reciprocal, and brings the alternation of delight, when two persons love equally in turn. This result takes place for the benefit of friendship, when a friend is desirous that he, whom he loves, should enjoy a prosperous state equally with himself. Now, that equality does not take place otherwise than when a similarity in equal affection meets in both. For as like are united to like by an indissoluble connection, so those who are at variance are disunited amongst themselves, nor are they the friends of others. Now, the corruptions of enmity are produced from malevolence through a dissimilarity in manners, and a difference in life, and sects, and opposite dispositions. There are, likewise, he says, other kinds of friendship, one part of which is produced for the sake of pleasure, and another for that of a close relationship. Now, the love of a close relationship and of children is agreeable to nature, but that other feeling, which, abhorrent to the kindness of humanity, is called love, is a burning desire, by the lighting up of which the lovers of the body, being caught through their lustfulness, imagine a person to exist wholly in that which they see and wish for. Such unhappy feelings, in the case of the soul, Plato forbids to be called by the name of friendship, because they are not mutual, nor can be reciprocated, so that what is loved may be loved in return, nor is there constancy in them, and a length of time is wanting to them, and loves of that kind are put an end to by satiety and repentance. 14. Of loves of this kind, Plato numbers 3, because there is one, divine, agreeing with a mind uncorrupted, and the method of virtue, and not to be repented of. Another, pertaining to a degenerate mind, and to pleasure the most corrupt. The third, mixed up with both, belonging to a mediocre disposition, and of moderate desires. But souls of a darker hue, he says, are impelled by a longing for the body, and that their only aim is to enjoy the use of it, and to soften down their heart by a pleasure and gratification of that kind. But these are the acts of an elegant and well-educated mind, to love passionately the souls of the good, and to make them a study, and to wish it done that they should indulge as much as possible in good pursuits, and be rendered better and superior. The mean between the two, he says, is formed of both, so that they are not entirely void of bodily gratifications, and yet are able to be caught by an elegant disposition of soul. As then that love is inferred to be the most filthy and the least human and base, not from the nature of things, but from a bodily sickness and disease, so it may be believed that the divine love comes into the minds of men when it is granted by the gift and kindness of the gods, and by the breath of a celestial Cupid. There is, too, a third kind of love, which we have mentioned as the mean. It is brought together by the proximity of what is divine and earthly, and since it is united by the connection of a joint state amongst like persons, it is, as being near to reason, the divine one, but the earthly as being united to baseness and the longing after pleasure. 15. Of persons worthy of blame there are 4 kinds, of which the first is of the seekers after honors, the next is of the lovers of substance, the third of the lovers of popular rule, and the last of tyrannical power. On which account that first vice comes upon the mind when the vigor of reason has become languid, and that portion of the soul in which anger has the dominion becomes the superior and stronger. Now that which is called oligarchia, oligarchy, is produced in this way, when on account of the worst food being given to that part of the soul which consists of desires, not only are the seats of what is rationable and given to anger occupied, but of that likewise which sharpen not necessary desires. Such a person as this, Plato has designated a gain-seeker and a hawk after money. The popular quality exists when passions, being let loose by indulgence, burn not only with just desires, but with those likewise which pervert from right the parties meeting with them, and oppress with their own conditions both the soul that is susceptible of good counsel, and the other too that is given rather to anger. But tyrannical power is a life of luxury and full of lust, which, welded together out of pleasures endless and various, and unlawful, holds a dominion over the entire mind. 16. Now the person who is the worst, Plato says, is not only base and pernicious, and a despiser of the gods, and lives a life without moderation, and inhuman, and unsociable, but agrees likewise with neither his neighbors nor himself, and thus is at variance not only with other persons, but himself likewise, and is an enemy not to others only, but likewise to himself, and hence such a person is friendly neither to the good, nor to any one at all, and not even to himself, but that he, whom no excess of wickedness can go beyond, appears to be the worst of all. He says, too, that such a person can never find a way for himself in the conduct of affairs, not merely on account of his ignorance, but because he knows not himself, and because thorough wickedness produces an unsettling in the mind by impeding that person's designs when commenced and reflected on, and by not permitting any of those things to be done which he may wish. Hence, against a person, the worst, and most reprobate, not only do those vices, which are according to nature, produce a feeling of execration, such as envy is, and a delight in the misfortunes of others, but those likewise which nature does not reject, I mean pleasure, and sickness of mind, regret, love, pity, fear, shame, and anger. Now, this takes place on that account, because an ill-regulated disposition has no moderation in whatever matter to which it rushes forward, and thus there is for it ever something deficient or redundant. Hence, too, the love of a man of this kind is depraved in its whole tenor, because it is not only eager from its unbridled lusts and insatiable thirst to swallow all kinds of pleasure, but because it is distracted in its judgment of beauty by an error without reason, through its being ignorant of true loveliness, and being a passionate admirer of the skin of the body, effete, enervated, and passing away, nor does it set a great value at least upon limbs colored by the sun, or rendered firm by exercise, but values rather those darkened by shade, or soft by sloth, and molded with too much care. 17. That wickedness does not stalk abroad willingly is plain in many ways. For injuriousness, Plato says, is an ill-regulated suffering and sickness of the mind, from whence he holds it clear that men are not carried to it willingly. For who would, with his own will, take upon himself so much of evil as to carry knowingly crime and flagitiousness in the best portion of the mind? When, therefore, the possession of evil is taken by the unthinking, it is meet that its use and doings should be supported by the ignorant, and on that account it is a worse thing to hurt than to be hurt, because the hurt is in those things which are of less value, namely in those of the body, and external, which can be either diminished or perish by fraud, while the preferable are unhurt, that relate to the soul itself, while to hurt is a far worse act. From whence it can be understood that by this error a mischief is brought upon good souls, and that he hurts himself more, who desires the destruction of another, than he hurts him, against whom he plots things of such a kind. Since then to hurt another is of all evils the greatest, it is still much more grievous for him who does a hurt to depart with impunity, and it is more grievous and bitter than every punishment, if impunity is granted to a noxious person, and he does not suffer in the meantime a punishment from men, just as it is more grievous for a troop of most acute disorders to be in want of medicine, and to deceive medical men, and for those parts to be neither burnt nor cut off, by the pain of which the safety of the rest of the parts can be provided for. 18. Hence, as the best physicians do not apply healing hands to bodies despaired of and cried over as lost, in order that the attendants, which would do no good, may not prolong the period of pain, so it is better for those to die whose souls are stained by vices, and cannot be cured by the medicine of wisdom. For Plato thinks that the man ought to be driven from life, by whom the study of living properly cannot be obtained from nature or his own exertions, or, if the love of life holds him fast, that he ought to be delivered over to the wise, by whose art at some time he may be turned to better things. And truly it is better for such a person to be ruled over, and not to have the power of ruling over others, and to be not a lord, but a slave himself, as being impotent over his own vices, and to be assigned to the power of others, after obtaining as his lot the office of obeying rather than of commanding. He said likewise that the worse man is the greater reprobate, not on the sole ground that he is ever distracted by a choice of vices, and torn in pieces by the wave swell of desires, but because the more he is desirous of more things, the more he seems to himself to be in want, and on that account to others likewise. For the things that are hoped and wished for arrive scarcely a few in number, and by the greatest trouble, and to these succeeds the still more burning madness of desires. Nor by future evils only he is pained, but tortured likewise by the past and those in transit, all of which persons it is manifest can be drawn from evils of that kind by death alone. 19. But the preeminently good and the immoderately bad are very few, and rather scarce, and, as he says, may be counted. But the majority are those who are neither clearly the best, nor really the worst, but with, as it were, a medium in morals. And yet, neither do the more excellent of them lay hold of all right things, nor do those who are to be blamed stumble in all. Of these the vices are not heavy, nor out of season, nor with too much of crime, whose basis is in a redundance or deficiency, to whom there is of approbation both an entirety and measure, and who, while they are taking a middle road between praise and blame, are constantly excited by the desire of undertaking matters of that kind, that at one time persons good and honorable invite them by reason, at another dishonorable gains and base pleasures attract them. With such men, fidelity in friendship does not endure, and loves, not always incorrect, nor yet honorable, come into their minds. 20. A man, therefore, Plato says, cannot be perfectly wise, unless he excels the rest of men in disposition, and is complete in the arts, and in the parts of prudence, and has been imbued with them even from boyhood, and accustomed to deeds and words in accordance, while his soul has been cleansed and strained from the lees of pleasure, and abstinence and patience have been chosen with his whole soul, and learning and eloquence have proceeded from the knowledge of things. He, however, who has gone through these matters, and walked with a confident and secure step in the road of virtue, and has acquired a solid method of living, becomes on a sudden perfect. That is, he reaches on a sudden the extreme portions of time, past and future, and is in a certain manner intemporal. After this, when vices are shut out, and all things implanted and introduced, which conduce to a happy life, the wise man thinks correctly that he does not depend upon others, nor can anything be brought upon himself from others, but that all things are in his own hand. On which account he is neither elated in prosperity, nor does he become contracted by adversity, when he knows that he is so furnished with adornments that he can be separated from them by no violence. Such a person it behoves not only to inflict no injury, but even not to return it. For he does not consider that to be an act of contumely which a wicked man commits, but he considers that to be so which patience cannot firmly endure. By which law of nature, let it be engraven on his mind that not one of those things which the rest of mankind conceive to be evils can do a hurt to a wise man. Indeed, Plato asserts that the wise man, relying on his conscience, will be secure and confident in the whole of life, both because he considers, by drawing himself to better reasons, that all things are accidents, and because he receives nothing with moroseness or difficulty, and persuades himself that his affairs belong to the immortal gods. The same person beholds the day of his death creeping on, neither unwillingly nor without hope, because he trusts in the immortality of the soul. For the soul of the wise man, when liberated from the bonds of the body, migrates back to the gods, and for the merits of a life past, rather purely and chastely, he does by this very endeavor conciliate himself to the condition of the gods. 21. To the same wise man he gives the name of the best, and he rightly considers him both good and prudent, whose sound plans agree with acts the most correct, and whose principles proceed from a reason for what is just. This wise man, he further says, is the most brave, since by the vigor of his mind he is prepared to endure all things. Hence it is, he says, that fortitude is the nerve and very neck of the soul, just as cowardice, he says, borders upon weakness. Him, too, he correctly considers the only wealthy man, since he alone appears to possess the riches of virtue, which are more precious than all treasures. Moreover, the wise man ought to appear the most wealthy indeed, since he alone is able to rule over wealth for necessary uses. For the rest of men, although they are flowing over with riches, seem nevertheless to be poor, because they either know not their use, or apply them to the worst purposes. For it is not the absence of money that gives birth to want, but the presence of immoderate desires. It behoves then the philosopher, if he will be in want of nothing, and the despiser of, and superior to, all those things, which men consider bitter to be borne, to do nothing otherwise than to endeavor constantly to separate the soul from its fellowship with the body, and hence philosophy is to be deemed a desire for death, and a habit of dying. 22. It is meet for all good men to be friends amongst themselves, even if they are little known to each other, and they are to be considered friends by that power through which their manners and tenets agree, since like is not abhorrent from like. From hence it is clear that the fidelity of friendship can exist amongst the good alone. Now wisdom makes that young man a sedulous lover of good, who, by the goodness of his disposition, is rather ready to learn good arts. Nor will a deformity of body be able to drive away such a desire. For when the soul itself is pleasing, the whole man is loved, but when the body is desired, a man's worst part becomes agreeable to the heart. Justly then it is to be deemed that he, who is acquainted with good persons, will be desirous likewise of things of that kind. for he alone burns with good desires, who sees what is good with the eyes of the mind. This is to be wise. But because he, who is ignorant of that, must needs be a hater also, and not a friend of virtue. Nor vainly is such a person a lover of disgraceful pleasures. But the wise man will not come in the manner of a wild beast, to do something for the sake of some pleasure, unless there shall be at hand the honorable emoluments of virtue. The same person it behoves to live a life in this kind of pleasure, honorable and admirable, and full of praise and glory, and to be preferred to all the rest of men, not only for the sake of these things, but to enjoy likewise alone and always its pleasantness and security. Nor will he be pained when deprived of the dearest objects of affection, either because all things which tend to happiness depend on himself, or because the infliction of such pain is forbidden by the decree and law of right reason, or because, if he tortures himself on such a ground, or takes upon himself that sickness of mind for the sake of him who is dead, as if the person were in a worse part, for his own sake, because he grieves that he has been deprived of such an acquaintance. But neither for the sake of the dead ought lamentations to be indulged in, since we know that the party has suffered no evil, and, if he had been with good feelings, that he is added to the number of the better, nor for the sake of himself, inasmuch as he places everything upon himself, nor by the absence of anything can he be in want of virtue, of which he claims for himself the perpetual possession. The wise man, therefore, will not be sad. 23. The aim then of wisdom is that the wise man may by his merits be carried up to God, and this is about to be all his study, says Plato, that he may, by the emulation of his life, approach to the doings of the gods. Now, this will be able to happen to him if he shows himself a man perfectly just, pious, and prudent, from whence, not only in the knowledge of looking forward, but in the labor of acting, it is fitting for him to follow those things which are approved of by gods and men, since the highest of the gods not only thinks upon all this universe through the reasoning of his reflections, but undertakes the first, the middle, and the last, and regulates what has been discovered thoroughly by the universality and constancy of a provident arrangement. Moreover, he says that the person appears to be happy to all to whom good is supplied, and who knows in what manner he ought to be free from vices. Now, one kind of happiness is when we protect by the presence of our talents what we are doing; another, when nothing is wanting to the perfection of life, and we are content with the mere contemplation of it. Now, of each kind of happiness the source flows from virtue. But for the adornment of the genial place, or virtue, we need none of these aids from without, which we deem to be good. But for the uses of ordinary life there is a need of the care of the body, and of the protection of these things which come from without, yet, however, in such wise that they may become better by virtue, and, by its assistance, be united to the advantages of happiness, without which they are least of all to be held in the place of good things. Nor is it in vain that virtue alone can make persons most happy, since without it happiness cannot be found from other prosperous affairs. Since we say that the wise man is a foot-follower and imitator of God, and we fancy that he does follow the deity. For this does the saying mean, hepu theo, follow God. Now, not only does it behove him, while he inhabits this life, to speak words worthy of the gods, and not to do those acts which are displeasing to their majesty, but at that time likewise, when he is leaving the body, which he will not do against the will of God. For, though the power over death is in his hand, and though he knows that by leaving the things of earth he shall obtain what are better, still he ought not to bring death upon himself, unless the divine law shall decree that he must of necessity suffer it. And if the adornments of his previously past life do him honor, still it behoves him to be more honorable and the lover of a favorable report, when, careless of the life of his posterity, he permits his soul to pass to immortality, and anticipates, because he has lived piously, that it will inhabit the places of the blessed, and mingle with the choirs of the gods and demigods. 24. Respecting the constitution of states, and the preservation of commonwealths to be ruled over, Plato thus ordains. At the very commencement, he defines the form of a state after this fashion. A state is the union of very many persons amongst themselves, where some are rulers, others inferiors, bringing, when united, aid and assistance to each other in turn, and regulating their duties by the same and correct laws. And a state would be one, like a villa, under the same walls, if the minds of the inhabitants are accustomed to like and dislike the same things. On which account we must persuade the founders of commonwealths that they increase their own people to that point of places in such a way that all may be known to the same ruler, and not unknown to each other. For thus it will happen that all will be of one mind, and be willing for justice to be done to them. But a great and healthy state it does not behove to depend on the multitude of its inhabitants, and on their great strength. For Plato thinks that not the power of the body, nor of money, collected for the dominion of the many, is to be valued, with a bad heart and impotence, but when men, adorned with all virtues, and all the inhabitants, founded on laws, obey a common decree. But the rest of states, which are not constituted after this model, he did not deem to be healthy, but were commonwealths, filthy, and swelling with disorders. Those, however, he said, were founded on reason, which were arranged after the manner of the soul, so that the best portion which excels in wisdom and prudence may rule over the multitude, and, as that has the care of the whole body, so the beloved of prudence may defend the things advantageous to the state in general. And let fortitude likewise, the second portion of virtue, as it chastises and restrains the feeling of desire by its road, be vigilant in the state. And, in the place of watchers by day, let the youth become soldiers for the benefit of all. But let the discipline of a superior council bridle, restrain, and, if requisite, break down the restless and untamed, and on that account the worst of citizens. But that third part of the soul, the seat of desires, he considers on a par with the common people and land tillers, which he thinks is to be supported for its moderate usefulness. He denies, however, that a commonwealth can stand unless he who rules possesses the desire for wisdom, or unless he is chosen as the ruler who, it is agreed amongst all, is the most wise. 25. He says, moreover, that all the citizens should be imbued with morality, so that there may be no desire of possessing gold and silver in those to whose guardianship and good faith the commonwealth is entrusted, and that they may not seek private wealth under the guise of its being public, and that hospitality may not take place of such a kind that, while the door is not open to others, they may so take care of food and living for themselves, as to waste on common feasts the money they may receive from those whom they protect. Marriages, too, he says, are not to be entered into individually, but are to be common, through the wise men of the states and magistrates appointed to that business by lot, arranging in a public manner the betrothals for marriages of that kind, and taking especial care that persons be not united unequal to, or unlike each other. With these is connected a useful and necessary confusion, so that through the bringing up of children, unknown as yet, being mixed together, there is produced a difficulty of recognition by parents. For, while they do not know their own, they believe all, whom they may see of that age, to be their own, and all become, as it were, the parents of all the children in common. Of these marriages there is sought at a proper time the union, of which he believes the fidelity will be firm, if the number of the days accords with the harmony of music, while they who are born of such marriages will be imbued with fitting studies and taught by the best instructors in the common master hall of the preceptors, and this too, not merely those of the male sex, but of the female likewise, whom Plato wishes to be united in all arts that are thought to be peculiar to men, and even in those of war, since to both there is the same power, as their nature is one. He says, too, that a state of this kind has no need of laws, laid down from without, for, being founded on the rules of prudence, and on that kind of institutions and manners, of which mention has been made, it does not require other laws. And this commonwealth he contends to have been formed by himself, as a feigned representation of the truth, for the sake of an example. 26. There is likewise another commonwealth built up by him, sufficiently just, and the best indeed, in a certain appearance, and by way of an example, and not, as the former is, without proofs, but with some groundwork. In this, after seeking the principles of the origin of a state and its foundations, he discusses, not in his own name, its situation and advantages, and he proceeds to the point as to how a civil governor, after obtaining a place of that kind, and an assembly of many persons, ought, according to the nature of things present, and of persons coming together, to build up a state full of good laws, and of good morals. In this too, he wishes the same bringing up of children, and the same discipline in arts to be adopted. But in the case of marriages, and births, and patrimonies, he swerves from the rules laid down for the former commonwealth, by making marriages an affair of individuals, and the business of the suitors themselves private. But, though the parties in contracting a marriage ought to take counsel from their own wishes, yet he decrees that the matter, as belonging to public good, ought to be looked into by the chiefs of the state in general. Wherefore, let not the rich refuse a marriage with their inferiors, and let those in poverty obtain an union with the rich. And, should there be an agreement in the strength of property, still different dispositions are to be mixed together, so that a quiet woman may be joined to a passionate man, and to a mild man may be united a rather excitable woman, in order that by such remedies, and the fruits of living together, the offspring, formed out of differing natures, may coalesce by a better produce of manners, and so the state be increased by the means of families put together. Children, too, conceived in the seed-bed of dissimilar manners, when drawing in the fashion of a likeness of both, there will be wanting in them neither vigor in carrying on affairs, nor counsel in surveying them, but they are to be instructed according as the parents may determine. Individuals, too, may have houses and private property, as they may be able, which, however, he does not permit to be increased by avarice, or wasted by luxury, or deserted through negligence. And for this state he orders laws to be promulgated, and he exhorts the framer of laws, when he has an idea of doing such a thing, to direct his contemplation to virtue. 27. As regards the mode of government, he considers that to be useful which is formed by the mixture of three kinds, for he does not think that the mere form of government, either by the upper orders or of the mob, is by itself useful, nor does he leave the faults of rulers unpunished, but he determines that a reason for ruling exists, rather with those who are the superior in power, and other conditions of public affairs are thought to be defined by him which have a leaning towards correct morals, and to the ruler over the commonwealth, which he wishes to stand fast by the correction of errors, he gives an order that he first fill up the laws remaining incomplete, and that he desire the laws to be corrected that are wrong, and then that he turn the teachings which are corrupting the good of the state to a better account, from which, if the depraved masses cannot be turned aside by advice and persuasion, they must be drawn from the course they have commenced by force, and without a show of favor to anyone. He describes, too, how in an active state the whole mass conducts itself when led by goodness and justice, For such persons will take to their arms their nearest relations, will guard their honors, drive off intemperance, restrain injustice, and give to modesty and the other ornaments of life the greatest honors. Nor let a multitude rashly fly together to the constitutions of commonwealths of that kind, except those who have been brought up under the best laws and superior institutions, and are moderate towards others, and agreeing amongst themselves. 28. Of citizens worthy to be blamed, there are 4 kinds. One is of those who are the chiefs in honor, another is of the few, with whom the power over affairs rests. The third is of the rule of all, the last of that of a tyrant. Now, the first kind, he says, is produced then, when the more prudent persons are driven from the state by seditious magistrates, and the power is transferred to these, who are strong in hand merely, and when not those who could conduct affairs with milder counsels obtain the means of ruling, but those who are turbulent and violent. But the state of the few is obtained when many persons, poor and criminal, and at the same time lying under the impotence of the wealthy few, give themselves up and permit, and when all the power of government, not good morals, but riches have obtained. The popular faction is strengthened when the mass, without wealth, does, by its strength, hold out against the means of the rich, and the law is at the bidding of the people promulgated, that it is lawful for all to obtain honors equally. After this there arises then the individual head of that tyranny, when he who shall have broken through the laws, through his contempt for them, shall make an attack upon the government, after being fitted for it by a similar conspiracy amongst the lawless, and ordain subsequently that the whole mass of citizens are to obey his desires and wishes, and to regulate their obsequiousness by such an aim. Book 3. On the Philosophy of Reasoning. 1. The study of wisdom, which we call philosophy, seems to most persons to contain 3 kinds or parts, relating to nature, and morals, and reasoning, of which last I now propose to speak, and in which is comprehended the art of discussion. But while we are discussing the subject of speaking, of which there are various kinds, such as of giving a command or orders, of narrating, wishing, vowing, being angry, hating, envying, favoring, pitying, admiring, despising, reproaching, repenting, deploring, and as well of bringing pleasure as of striking terror, in which it is the part of a superior speaker to be able to make statements that are diffused in a narrow compass, and what are narrowed in a wide one, what is commonplace in a pretty manner, and what is new in a customary one, to make what is great little, and matters very great out of little, and to do very many other things of that kind. There is, amongst these, one relating for the most part to a proposition. This is called enunciable when it comprehends an absolute sentiment, and is the only one of all that is exposed to truth or falsehood, which Sergius calls effactum, an expression, vado, proloquium, a forespeaking, Cicero, enunciatum, an enunciation, the Greeks, protasin, a forestretching, likewise axioma, which I render word for word as well by protensionem as by rogamentum, an asking, but which may be called more familiarly a proposition. 2. Now, of propositions, as well as of their conclusions, there are 2 kinds. One, the predicative, which is simple too, as if we should say, he who rules is happy. Another, substitutive, or conditional, which is compounded too, as if you should say, he who rules, if he is wise, is happy. For you substitute a condition, through which a person, unless he is wise, is not happy. But we will now speak of the predicative, which naturally precedes and is, as it were, the element, id est, the principle, of the substitutive. There are, likewise, other differences, namely, of quantity and quality. Of quantity, in that some are general, as every breathing thing is alive, others particular, as some animals do not breathe, others undefined, as animal breathes. For the assertion does not define whether it is everyone or someone. Nevertheless, it always avails in the place of a particular, because it is more safe to admit from what is uncertain that which is less. But of quality, in that some are affirmative, because they affirm something about something, as virtue is a good. For it affirms that there is goodness in virtue, others negative, as virtue is not a good. For it denies that there is goodness in virtue. The Stoics consider this too an affirmative when they say, it happens to a certain pleasure to be not a good. It affirms, therefore, what happens to it, that is, what it is. For that reason, they say, it is affirmative, because it affirms there is in that thing, in which it has denied there is that, which does not seem to be in it. But they call that alone negative, to which a negative particle is prefixed. Now, these will be beaten as well in other points as in this. Should a person make this inquiry, that which has not substance does not exist. For they will be compelled, according to what they assert, to confess that what has no substance is that which does not exist. 3. A proposition, says Plato in the Theaetetus, consists of two parts of speech, a noun and verb, in the fewest words, as Apuleius discusses, which is either true or false, and is therefore a proposition. From whence some have laid it down that there are only those two parts of speech, because from those alone can be formed a perfect speech, that is, one which includes a sentence entirely, and that adverbs and pronouns and participles and conjunctions and the rest of things of that kind, which grammarians enumerate, are no more the parts of speech than are the parts of ships their ornaments, or of men their hairs, but that in the whole framework of a speech they are certainly to be reckoned in the place of bolts and pitch and glue. Moreover, of the two parts before mentioned, one is called the subjective, as if it were placed under, as Apuleius; the other, the declarative, as discusses, or discusses not. For it declares what Apuleius is doing. It is permissible, however, while the meaning remains the same, to extend each part to more words, as if instead of Apuleius you should say, the Platonic philosopher of Madaura, and, in like manner, instead of discussing, you should say that he is making use of a speech. For the most part, the subject is the minor in a proposition, and the predicate the major, inasmuch as it embraces not only this subject, but others likewise. For not only does Apuleius discuss, but many others who can be comprehended under the same predicate, unless, perchance, a peculiarity belonging to something is predicated of it, as if you should say, that which is a horse is able to neigh. Now, to neigh is peculiar to a horse. Hence, in these peculiarities, equal is the predicate, and equal too the subject, but not, as in other cases, the former is the major, since when the same proposition might conversely become the subject, and have as the predicate of itself that which it had previously as the subject, as if by changing the order you should say, that which is able to neigh is a horse. But you would not be able to convert in like manner the terms when they are unequal, for, not because it is true that every man is an animal, will it on that account be true if you convert the terms that every animal is a man? For it is not as peculiar to a man to be an animal as it is to a horse to neigh, since there are other animals without number. Hence, the predicate is known in many ways, although the question be proposed in a converse order. First, because the predicate can embrace more things than the subject. Next, because it is never ended by a noun, but always by a verb, by which especially it is distinguished, even in the peculiarities alluded to, from an equal subject. This likewise is to be considered in the way of a comparison, that as propositions taken as a whole are both definite and indefinite, so it is agreed that portions of them, subjective as well as declarative, are partly defined as man and animal, and partly undefined as not a man and not an animal. For they do not define what a thing is when they say it is not, but merely show that there is something else besides it. 4. We must now state in what manner these four propositions are affected towards each other, which it will not be foreign to the purpose to view in the figure of a square. Let there be then, on the upper line, as expressed below, an affirmative and a negative, both universal, as all pleasure is a good, and no pleasure is a good. And let these be called disagreeing. And in like manner, on the lower line, under each universal, let a particular be noted. Some pleasure is a good, and some pleasure is not a good. And let these be called sub-equals to each other. Then let oblique lines be drawn from the angles of the square, one extending from the universal affirmative to the particular negative, another from the particular affirmative to the universal negative, and let them, as they are the contrary to each other in quantity and quality, be called one or the other, because it is necessary for one or the other to be true, which is called a perfect and whole contest. But between the sub-equals and the disagreeing, the contest is divided, because the disagreeing never become at the same time true, although they are occasionally at the same time false, while conversely, the sub-equals are never indeed false at the same time, although occasionally they are at the same time true, and on this account, the refutation of either of these confirms the other, whereas the confirmation of either does not refute the other. But of the disagreeing, he who has laid down either one takes off the other, whereas conversely, he who takes off either one does not lay down the other. For in truth, he who confirms either of the so-called one or the other never refutes the other, while he who refutes the other confirms either of the so-called one or the other. But when either of the universals is proved, it confirms its own particular, but when it is refuted, it does not weaken it, and conversely, when either of the particulars is refuted, it weakens its own universal, but when it is proved, it does not confirm it. Now, that all this is so, as we assert, that which is delineated below easily shows from the propositions themselves, for it is ascertained what a person concedes, who shall have made any proposition. 5. Now, either of the universals is destroyed in three ways: when its particular is shown to be false, or either one of the two others, whether the disagreeing or the subneutral. But it is supported in one way, if the subneutral belonging to it is shown to be false. On the other hand, either of the particulars is destroyed if its subneuter, but it is supported in three ways: if its universal is true, or either of the two others is false, whether its sub-equal or subneuter. The same facts we shall observe in the case of equivalent propositions. Now, those are said to be equivalent, which, under another enunciation, have an equal power, and are at the same time true, or at the same time false, one on account of the other, as the undefined and the particular. Moreover, every proposition, if it assumes, at its commencement, a negative particle, becomes, as its subalternate equivalent, as when there is an universal affirmative, all pleasure is a good. If a negation be prefixed to it, it will be, not all pleasure is a good, having the same meaning as its subalternate had, some pleasure is not a good. And in the three other propositions, the same thing is to be understood. 6. Then, with respect to conversion, an universal negative and its subalternate, a particular affirmative, are said to be convertible propositions on that account, because their portions, subjective and declarative, are able to preserve always their mutual changes, the condition of truth or falsehood still remaining. For, as this proposition is true, no prudent man is impious, so, if you make a change in its parts, it will be true to say, no impious man is prudent. In like manner, as it is false to say, no man is an animal, so, if you make a change, it will be false to say, no animal is a man. By parity of reasoning, a particular affirmative becomes convertible. A certain grammarian is man, and a certain man is a grammarian. This result the two other propositions cannot always affect, although they sometimes undergo a conversion, nor yet are they on that account said to be convertible, for that which sometimes deceives is rejected as uncertain. Each proposition must, therefore, be laid open through all its significations as to whether it agrees when it is taken conversely. Nor are those universally true, but only 5. For either the peculiarity of something is declared, or its genus, or difference, or defined limit, or accident. Nor, beyond these predicates, can anything be found in any proposition. For instance, should you lay down man as the subject, you would say something of him, or mark out a peculiarity of his, as being able to laugh, or his genus as an animal, or his difference as being rational, or defined limit as a mortal animal endued with reason, or accident as being an orator. Since everything which is declarative of anything either can or cannot be in turn its subjective, and if it can, it either marks out what it is, and is thus a defined limit, or it does not mark out, and is thus a peculiarity. But, if it cannot, there is either that which ought to be placed in the definition, and thus there is a genus or difference, or what ought not to be placed, and is thus an accident. Through these means, then, it will be known that the particular negative is not convertible. Now, the universal affirmative is not by itself convertible, but it can be, nevertheless, made convertible as a particular. For example, when the proposition is, every man is an animal, it cannot be converted so as to be, every animal is a man. But it may be as a particular, a certain animal is man. But this is, in a simple conversion, which is called in the inferences of conclusions a reflex. There is likewise another conversion of propositions, which draws not only the order, but likewise the parts themselves to the contrary, so that what is defined becomes undefined, and on the other hand, what is undefined becomes defined. This conversion, the two remaining, namely the universal affirmative and the particular negative admit in turn as every man is an animal, and everything that is not an animal is not a man. In like manner, a certain animal is not rational, and a certain thing which is not rational is not an animal. Now, that this is so constantly, as we have said, you will discover by exploring all the 5 species before mentioned. 7. The combination of propositions is said to be their connection through another common part, by which they are united, for they can thus agree towards one conclusion. Now, that common part must needs be in both propositions the subject, or in both the predicate, or in one the subject, and in the other the predicate. The forms therefore become 3, of which let that be called the first, when that common part is in one the subject, in the other the predicate, which order is content, not with an enumeration only, but with the worthiness of the conclusions, since the third form is the last, because from it nothing is inferred except a particular, but superior to this is the second, which contains universal inferences, but only of a negative kind, and the first is thus the powerful one, because in it every kind of inferences is contained. Now, I call that an inference or inferential question, which is collected and inferred from admissions. Moreover, an admission is the proposition which is conceded by the respondent. For instance, should a person propose this question: is every honorable thing good? It is a proposition, and if the respondent says that he assents, there is, on the question being removed, an admission, which is itself in common parlance the proposition: every honorable thing is good. To this you may unite another admission, proposed and conceded in a similar manner: every good thing is useful. From this combination arises, as we shall presently show, the inferential kind of the first mode, universal, if stated directly. Therefore, every honorable thing is useful, but particular, if stated inversely. Therefore, a useful thing is honorable, because a universal affirmative can be converted in the manner of a particular only in the case of inverted propositions. Now, an inference, I say, is made directly when the same part is the subject, as well in the combination as in the inference itself, and likewise the predicate is the same when it exists in both ways, but it is made inversely when the same thing takes place in an inverse order. 8. Now, let the whole of the reasoning, which is made up of admissions and inferences, be called by the name of a gathering together of a conclusion, and it may be most conveniently defined, according to Aristotle, as a discourse in which some things being conceded, something else beside what have been conceded necessarily turns out, but yet through what have been conceded. In which definition, no other kind of a discourse is to be understood than what is enunciable, which, as we have stated above, is alone either true or false, and the expression, some things being conceded, is put in the plural on that account, because a gathering together cannot take place from one admission, although it appears to Antipater the Stoic, contrary to the opinion of all, that this conclusion is complete. Thou seest, therefore thou art alive. Whereas it would be complete in this way: if thou seest, thou art alive, but thou dost see, therefore thou art alive. Moreover, because we want to draw a conclusion not in what is conceded, but in what is denied, on that account it is stated in the definition that something else necessarily turns out beside what has been conceded. On which account the forms adopted by the Stoics are superfluous, that go through not the same thing in a different manner. For example, it is day or night. Now it is day. Moreover, they double the same. If day is, therefore, day is. Vainly, then, do they draw an inference where a concession is made willingly and without a controversy. This is more like the truth when I assert, if day is, there is light. Now, day is, therefore it is light. That I am not wrongly drawing a conclusion beyond what I have admitted. For it is light, which is in the conclusion, has been also in the major proposition. But this we will refute in this manner by saying that, therefore it is light, is said in a different manner in the conclusion, so that it may be shown it is now light. But it is taken in a different manner in the minor proposition, in which it is not said that it is now light, but merely that it follows that if there be day, there will be likewise light. Now, there is a great difference whether you affirm that something exists in this way now, or merely that it is wont to be when something else goes before. That, too, has taken place, namely, that in the same definition the idea of necessity has been included, in order that the force of the conclusion may be distinguished from the likeness to an induction. For in an induction some things are conceded. For instance, a man moves the lower jaw, a horse moves the lower jaw, and so does the ox and dog. From these admissions, something else is inferred in the conclusion. Therefore, every animal likewise moves the lower jaw. But as this is not true in the case of the crocodile, you cannot, although the preceding are conceded, admit the inference which it would not have been lawful for you to refuse in the conclusion, since the inference is comprehended in the admission itself, and on this account there has been added the expression, turn out necessarily. Nor is even the last part of the definition superfluous, but it shows, from the very things which it has conceded, that the inference ought to turn out, but not that it would be established. 9. But on these points enough has been said, and we must now lay down by what modes and combinations true conclusions take place within a determinate number of the predicative kind of propositions. In the first form there are found 9 modes, taken by themselves, but 6 combinations. In the second, 4 modes, but 3 combinations. In the third, 6 modes, but 5 combinations, respecting which, taken in their order, I will here put down the proofs, premising that a conclusion cannot be established from particular propositions alone, or from negative alone, because they can often lead even to what is false. Moreover, that although, if either negative is united to many affirmatives, an inference is produced, not affirmative, but negative, still only one negative, mixed with the rest, has any power. Similar, too, is the force of particular propositions, for either of them, if mixed with universals, produces a particular inference. Hence, in the first form, the first mode is that which deduces from universal affirmatives an universal affirmative directly, as, every just thing is honorable. Now, every honorable thing is good. Therefore, every just thing is good. But if you draw the inference by a bend, for instance, therefore a certain good thing is just, there is produced by the same combination the fifth mode, for in this manner alone I have shown above can an universal affirmative undergo a bend. The second mode is that which deduces from universals affirmative and negative, an universal negative directly, as, every just thing is honorable, but no honorable thing is base. Therefore, no just thing is base. Now, if you draw the inference by a bend as, therefore, no just thing is base, you will produce the sixth mode, for, as it has been stated, an universal negative is bent back on itself. We ought, however, to remember only that the subject is to be drawn from the affirmative to the inference in the second mode, and on that account, it, the affirmative, is to be considered the prior, although the negative is enunciated previously. In like manner, in the case of the rest, that which is the prior in power is to be undestroyed as the prior in order. But in the sixth mode, the subjective is drawn from the negative, and this is their only difference. Further, the third mode is that which deduces from affirmatives, particular and universal. A particular affirmative as, a certain just thing is honorable, but every honorable thing is useful. Therefore, a certain just thing is useful. But if you draw an inference with a bend, therefore, a certain useful thing is just, you will produce the seventh mode, for, as it has been stated, a particular affirmative is turned back on itself. The fourth mode is that which deduces from a particular affirmative and an universal negative a particular negative directly, as, a certain just thing is honorable, but no honorable thing is base. Therefore, a certain just thing is not base. From this mode are discovered the changes contrary to the preceding, since the eighth and ninth preserve the inference of that proposition, not as it is bent by it, and the two merely bend the combination itself by propositions called equivalent, and in an inverted order, so that the negative becomes the prior, and thus the mode is said to deduce both by an inversion of the combinations. For if you insert the universal negative of the fourth mode, and subjoin to it the universal affirmative, which the particular affirmative shall have inverted, there will be produced the eighth mode, which deduces from universals, negative and affirmative. A particular negative, in a bent manner as, no base thing is honorable, but every honorable thing is just. Therefore, a certain just thing is not base. But why the fourth mode alone should generate two others, while the rest generate only one each, the reason is, that if we invert both propositions of the second mode, there will be produced a vain combination of two particular propositions. But if only one or the other, there will be produced either the second form or the third. 10. Of these 9 modes, in the first form, the 4 first are called non-demonstrable. Not because they cannot be demonstrated, as the swelling of the tides of the whole sea, which has not been demonstrated as yet by a person who knows the things of nature, and the squaring of the circle, but because they are so simple and so manifest as not to require demonstration, so that they produce themselves the rest, and impart from themselves a belief in them. Of the second form, we will now lay down the modes. The first mode in the second form is that which deduces from universals, affirmative and negative. An universal negative directly as, every just thing is honorable, but no base thing is honorable. Therefore, that which is not just is dishonorable. This mode is reduced to the second, not demonstrable, by its second terms being inverted. The second mode is that which deduces from the universals, negative and affirmative, an universal negative directly, as, no base thing is honorable, but every just thing is honorable. Therefore, no base thing is just. This mode does not differ from the former combination, except that it draws the subjective portion from the negative to the inference, because the order of the enunciation is varied in this way, a circumstance that could not take place in the first form. The third mode is that which deduces from a particular affirmative and an universal negative a particular negative directly, as, a certain just thing is honorable, but no base thing is honorable. Therefore, a certain just thing is not base. In this proposition, if we invert the universal negative, there will arise the fourth, not demonstrable, from which this is produced. The fourth mode is that which deduces from a particular negative and an universal affirmative a particular negative directly, as a certain just thing is not base, but every bad thing is base. Therefore, a certain just thing is not bad. Now, this mode alone is proved through the impossible alone, about which kind of proposition we will speak, while explaining the modes of the third form. 11. In the third form, the first mode is that which deduces from universal affirmatives a particular affirmative, as well directly as inversely, as every just thing is honorable, and every just thing is good. Therefore, a certain honorable thing is good. Or thus, therefore, a certain good thing is honorable. Since it matters not what part from each proposition you make the subject, as it does not matter which you first enunciate. Hence, Theophrastus does not rightly decide that on this account there is not one mode, but two. The second mode is that which deduces from affirmatives, particular and universal, an affirmative particular directly, as a certain just thing is honorable, and every just thing is good. Therefore, a certain honorable thing is good. The third mode is that which deduces from affirmatives, universal and particular, an affirmative particular directly, as every just thing is honorable, and a certain just thing is good. Therefore, a certain good thing is honorable. The fourth mode is that which deduces from universals, affirmative and negative, a negative particular directly, as every just thing is honorable, but no just thing is bad. Therefore, a certain honorable thing is not bad. The fifth mode is that which deduces from an affirmative particular and a negative universal, an affirmative particular directly, as a certain just thing is honorable, but no just thing is bad. Therefore, a certain honorable thing is not bad. The sixth mode is that which deduces from an affirmative universal and a negative particular a negative particular directly, as every just thing is honorable, and a certain just thing is not bad. Therefore, a certain honorable thing is not bad. 12. Of these six modes, the three first are reduced to the third not demonstrable by the first proposition of the first and second mode being inverted, while the third has the same combination with the second, but differing in this alone, that it takes from an universal its subjective portion, inasmuch as it is reduced to the third by the inversion not only of the proposition, but of the inference. In like manner, the fourth and fifth are produced from the fourth not demonstrable by their first propositions being inverted. But the sixth mode cannot be reduced to any not demonstrable mode by either both propositions or one or the other being inverted, but it is proved merely by what is impossible, just as the fourth mode in the second form, and on that account both are numbered the last. But of the rest the arrangement is made in all the forms according to the difference of the combinations and inferences. For, since to make an assertion is prior to giving a denial, and an universal has a greater power than a particular, universals are prior to particulars, and to both are similar an affirmation and an inference, and that mode is placed before, which is reduced more quickly to the not demonstrable mode, that is to say, by one inversion, which is one method of proving that those modes are fixed for a conclusion. There is likewise another method, which is common to all, even the not demonstrable, and which is said to be through what is impossible, and is called by the Stoics the first laying down, or the first exposition, which they define thus. If from two assertions a third is deduced, one of them, when it collects inferences from a contrary, leaves the contrary. But the old logicians have thus defined: when one or the other of two propositions is assumed, if the inference of every conclusion is done away, the remaining proposition is done away. Now, this was invented in opposition to those who, after admissions have been made, impudently refuse to receive what is deduced from them, while from that which they deny, something may be discovered contrary to that which they had previously conceded. Moreover, since it is impossible for contraries to be at one and the same time true, they are, consequently, driven by what is impossible to the conclusion. Nor have logicians vainly laid down that that mode is true in which the contrary to an inference, together with an admission of one or the other proposition, does away the remaining one. But the Stoics conceive that an inference is rejected by merely prefixing a negative particle, or that one of the propositions is done away, as, for example, all and not all, or someone and not someone. 13. There are then produced against each conclusion 8 of a contrary kind, which may be opposed to it, since each admission may be done away by two methods. And there are produced twice 4 conclusions by a negative particle being at one time prefixed to the inference, and at another by one or the other of the inferences being accepted. Let there be as an example the first not demonstrable mode. Every just thing is honorable, and every honorable thing is good. Therefore, every just thing is good. Now, he who, after admitting the propositions, denies the inference, must necessarily say, some one just thing is not good. To this, if you prefix the former of the two conceded, every just thing is honorable, an inference is produced, according to the second mode in the third form. Therefore, some one honorable thing is not good, which is repugnant to the second proposition that had conceded that every honorable thing is good. In like manner, this conclusion is altogether an opposite one, if, while things remain the same, you introduce its equivalent, as for instance, therefore, not everything honorable is good. In a similar manner, 2 other conclusions would be produced, if, as we have just now laid down the former proposition, so we assume the latter. Some one just thing is not good, but every honorable thing is good. There will be produced a double inference belonging to the fourth mode of the second form, namely, therefore, not every just thing is honorable, or, therefore, some one just thing is not honorable, both of which are equally repugnant to the former proposition which had conceded that every just thing is honorable. While these 4 conclusions remain, the proposition alone being changed, if, in lieu of that which was, some one just thing is not good, you make the proposition, not every just thing is good, so that the inference may be done away in 2 methods, there will be, through the same changes, 4 conclusions of the second form. In like manner, if in lieu of the same proposition you make it, no just thing is good, so that the inference may be done away by 3 methods, there will be 4 conclusions of the third form, but only in the case of those which have an universal inference, for that alone can be done away by 3 methods, but in the others there are only 8, which, if a person wishes, he will be able to arrange singly under each mode through all the forms, after the example we have laid down, so that in the manner of persons arguing hypothetically by means of letters, the order of the propositions being changed, while their power remains, the first, not demonstrable mode may be, A is affirmed of every B, and B of every C, therefore A is of every C. They begin from the declaring, and consequently from the second proposition. This mode, then, made perfect according to these, becomes backwardly of this kind. Every C is B, and every B is A. Therefore, every C is A. The Stoics, however, instead of letters adopt numbers, as if there is a first, there is a second, but there is a first, therefore there is a second. But Aristotle puts forth in the first form only 4 modes not demonstrable, while Theophrastus and the rest enumerate 5. For, by uniting an indefinite proposition, they deduce likewise an indefinite inference. But this it is needless to bring forward, since an indefinite proposition is done away in the place of a particular one, and the modes become the same as those in the case of a particular proposition. 14. So too, we have shown, there are 4 in the first form, which if a person wishes to double, by accepting an indefinite in the place of a particular, and subjoining an indefinite inference, there will be in all 29. But Aristo of Alexandria and some younger peripatetics suggest, moreover, 5 other modes of an universal inference, namely, 3 in the first form, and 2 in the second, in the place of which they deduce something of a particular one, for it is very silly for him, to whom more has been conceded, to infer less. Now it is proved that all the determinate modes in the 3 forms are only the 19 which we have shown above, for there are 4 propositions, namely, 2 particulars and 2 universals. Each of these, says Aristotle, is combined in 4 ways, so that it may be subjoined to itself, and be put before 3 others, and thus there will be 16 combinations in each form. Of these there are 6 that possess a power equally in all. 2, when of negatives, either one precedes the other, but 4, when of particulars, any one precedes itself, or is subjoined to another. For nothing can be concluded whenever there are either 2 particulars or 2 negatives. There remain then, for each form, 10 combinations. Moreover, out of these, as well in the first as second form, 2 possess no power when an universal affirmative is placed before a particular one. Similarly, in both the first and second form, 2 may be cut out, in which a particular negative precedes either of the universals. From whence it arises that there remain of the first form 6 combinations in 9 modes, and still 8 for the 2 remaining forms, of which there is one that is proved in neither of them, when an universal negative precedes a particular affirmative. Of those 7 which remain, there are 4 in the second form peculiar and false, when an universal affirmative is united either to itself or to its particular in any place, or when the other precedes. In like manner, 2 in the third form are peculiar, and possess no power, when either of the negatives precedes an universal affirmative. But the remaining 3 in the second form, and 5 in the third, we have shown to be determinate, when we reduced them to 6 combinations of the first form. Hence, out of 48 combinations, 14 alone are proved. The remaining 34, which I have reckoned up, are rejected, because they are able to exhibit false conclusions from true premises, of which it is easy for anyone to make a trial by means of the 5 significations mentioned above, of kind, peculiarity, etc. But of those 14 which we have proved, the inferences themselves show that there are not more modes than have been stated above, so that they may be received as well directly as inversely, as far as the very truth permits, and on that account their number cannot be increased.